Is my hair okay?
Welcome to Larry the Alchemist, where we discuss all things heavy metal and hard rock. On today's episode, I have a special guest with me. We are going to be discussing the effect of grunge that grunge had on the metal scene in Europe. Of course, I'm based here in the US, in the Tampa, Florida area, and I have my own history with it, what happened when grunge showed up, which we're gonna, let's say Nevermind from Nirvana came out in late 91. So I guess we could say grunge really started to take off in 1992. And it changed the landscape for heavy metal. For here in the States, I know a lot of people will say, well, metal didn't die. Of course it didn't die. There was still tons of stuff going on. You had the growing death metal scene there in the late 80s, and then really picking up speed in the early 90s. You had the black metal scene maybe starting to show up like around the mid 90s. But there's no denying that here in the States, at least, that metal was very much in the mainstream eye, whether it was on MTV or just in mainstream press. A lot of that was from the LA metal stuff, the hair metal stuff. But my favorite bands, my big six bands, Maiden Priest, Dio, Sabbath, Ozzy, AC/DC, they were releasing their biggest records, or their most successful records in the States were coming out in the 80s. And when grunge hit, maybe it had nothing to do with grunge. It might have just been a timing thing, because a lot of these bands that were my favorite bands, Maiden released Fear of the Dark in 92, X Factor in 95, Virtual 11 in 98, Priest released Jugulator in 97, Demolition in 01, Dio was releasing Strange Highways and Angry Machines. And although I like all these records, they did not have the same commercial success. Angry Machines was nowhere near as popular for Dio as Last in Line was, or Sacred Heart, or Dream Evil. And, some of that was maybe the artists and the music that they were putting out. Some of that was maybe the collective consciousness of people, wanting something different. And here in the States, when grunge hit, when it was in full swing, it really shifted the attention of the media and MTV and the mainstream, moved from LA and the Hollywood type stuff and moved that attention over to Seattle. So this is a conversation that I like to have with people, where I say, hey, somebody from Europe or from a different country, and I say, hey, what was it like in the 90s? Did grunge have the same impact in Europe as it did here in the States? So joining me here is my guest, Matthias Reinholdsson. He's been here at the Lair a whole bunch of times. Midweek Maiden, different topics, and thought it would be fun for him to give us the perspective of what it was like in the 90s. How did grunge affect metal? He's coming to us from Stockholm, Sweden, so he can give us the Scandinavian perspective on this, but also he's affected also by Europe, and I'm sure he has a feel for how grunge made an impact through all of Europe. So thank you, Matthias, for joining us here again.
Yeah.
All right, well, share with us.
Thank you for having me.
What were the 90s like? How did grunge affect you guys over there?
I'm glad you addressed this, because it's become some sort of truth in the general narrative of in rock and metal that grunge killed metal, and that truth has always bugged me quite a deal. We had a discussion a few weeks ago about this, and like I told you then, that I remember you told me a story about you've read an interview with Kip Winger or something like that, where he said that during the tour they could see how the sales literally dropped week by week, right?
Yeah, it was Kip Winger. He talked about how when Beavis and Butthead came on, which was an MTV thing right around that time of grunge, they went on a tour, and they were literally selling out big places. And the week later, they were half the size. The week after that, it was canceled. So he went within selling out large venues, small arenas. And 3 weeks later, his career was over. It was literally that fast. And if you listen to people who are in the business, Eddie Trunk, for instance, he was on radio at that time and everything. And he talks about how it was literally something, it wasn't a gradual thing. It wasn't like it was years where it just slowly faded out. It was literally months. That's what it felt like, months that it took. It was like a bomb was dropped and all these bands were just wiped out. And Eddie Trunk will talk about how anybody associated with, and he's specifically talking more about hair metal, but anybody that was associated with that hair metal type of stuff, nobody wanted to work with them because it had a real stigma to it. Nobody wanted to work with the photographers or the album cover people or the producers. All those guys because the producers, they were all known for, oh, you're the guy that recorded Rat. We don't want you on this new hip Seattle band. All those people just got all pushed to the side. And it was really like a very sudden overnight thing. It was like somebody flipped the switch and it just sort of obliterated these people. And it was like, almost like, and what was ironic about it was, and I've said this in other videos, was the first wave of grunge for me. When I say the first wave of grunge, I'm talking about Alice in Chains, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam. Nirvana for me had more of a punk thing, but all those bands felt like throwback bands. Soundgarden sounded to me like Black Sabbath. Pearl Jam sounded like a classic rock band. Alice in Chains sounded very old school metal. So when I heard it, it felt like a resurgence of metal, like, oh, wow, we're going back to the classic metal sound. And all those bands used the word metal, described themselves in those terms, at least Alice in Chains and Soundgarden. And they cited these bands as influences, and you heard, Soundgarden referred to as a metal band, but then all of a sudden this word grunge showed up, and it was like overnight, all these bands got, nobody wanted to associate with metal because unfortunately metal had gotten associated too much with the LA sound. And like I mentioned in the beginning, because I know somebody's going to come up in the comments, oh, but there was all this stuff. Yes, of course, there was still death metal and there was still tons of bands putting out albums. It isn't like metal, they stopped putting out records, but it was just for the mainstream, for the world of MTV, the world of Rolling Stone and stuff like that. It just sort of disappeared basically overnight. And you could say for a lot of people, that was a good thing because the whole hair metal LA thing had gotten way out of control and it needed to be reset. But it was just sort of strange how the impact that this had. So,
yeah. So, I mean, in fairness, when you're talking about metal, I mean, the truth is that grunge killed metal. You're actually talking about what we would describe as the AOR hair metal sort of bands.
But even the bigger bands, there's no denying that Maiden, Priest, Dio, Sabbath. I would say Ozzy was very successful through the 90s.
Yeah.
Metallica was very successful. They released the Black Album, I think, in 91. So they just got in right before it hit the fan. But there's no denying that Priest, Maiden, Dio, Sabbath, their record sales went down, and especially in the States. If you look at Iron Maiden and their touring schedule, they were canceling shows during that era. They were not playing the same place. They weren't playing 5 nights at Radio City Music Hall in 95. Their stock had dropped quite. They were still putting stuff out, but they were not selling the same amount of records here in the States as they were in in the 80s. So you could maybe blame it on grunge. You could blame it on the bands for, I've always said this, the albums that my favorite bands were putting out at that time weren't my favorite albums from those bands.
No,
those aren't my favorite Maiden records. Those aren't my favorite Priest records. Now, maybe I do really like those Sabbath records, but so there's that factored into it too.
Yeah. And I guess that, I totally agree with you that many of these bands didn't actually put out their greatest material. They were bands that had been going since the 70s or early 80s. And maybe they had started to run a little bit dry and needed to sort of reboot themselves. And that happened at the same time as these new bands that grew up listening to bands like Sabbath and Maiden and Priest and whatever. I mean, reading interviews at the time when grunge broke, they referred to all these bands like, yeah, but it was also that they referred to like the punk bands or stuff like that. In Europe, I wouldn't say that the drop of sales wasn't really that dramatic. I mean, from my perspective, growing up in Sweden, going to concerts, yeah, I didn't go to shows. The bands didn't play the same size venues, but then again, Maiden with Blaze Bayley singing played the same size large hockey arena in Stockholm in '98 as they did all during the '80s, and it was sold out. So I mean, the curve was starting to go upwards even before Bruce and Adrian came back into the band. And like you said, they didn't really put out their best material. I think some of the thing was that Maiden had a major lineup change when Adrian left first, and then when Bruce left, same thing. I mean, Richie Blackmore left Deep Purple in '93, was it? Yeah. I think Battle Rages On. And they used to play like bigger venues, at least in Sweden.
Rob Halford left Priest.
Exactly. So, I mean, all those big bands, and I mean, let's be fair, Black Sabbath hadn't been a big band since the early 80s.
Yeah.
I mean, their decline started already 82, 83, right about when they did the Born Again album. So, they weren't really a part of that decline, or whatever word you would like to use. But at the same time, like you said yourself, the metal scene was thriving. I mean, you had here in Sweden, the word death metal was really, really big, and that grew all the way through the '90s. Bigger underground bands, if I can use that term, like, I mean, Slayer wasn't slayed by grunge. There was no competition between those bands. It didn't really share the same audience. But I mean, for me and my friends, we just, when Alice in Chains, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, and Nirvana, when they became famous, it was like, hey, these are good. These bands put out new music. There wasn't any sort of, we hate those.
Yeah.
They're destroying our scene. I didn't hear people say stuff like that, but people say that now.
Yeah.
20 years, 30 years later, it's like, it's become this truth that they killed our scene. It's just not true.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, it was like, if any of my friends who were into hard rock and metal, we embraced Alice in Chains and Soundgarden, and again, that sort of first wave. But it sort of became this narrative, like you said, that was sort of put on it through the lens of history that, oh yeah, grunge killed heavy metal. And it may have, again, the AOR side of it, the Poisons and the Motleys of the world, they had a pretty miserable time in the 90s. Those bands, pretty much a lot of them stopped putting stuff out altogether. Now Priest and Maiden and AC/DC and those big bands, they slowed down a little. They had lineup changes and stuff like that. They had stuff, but they were still active. They were still putting stuff out. It was just that it wasn't getting quite the mainstream attention that it was. And like you said, there was all this stuff sort of coming up now with death metal and the different sort of crossover stuff, and the thrash started crossing over with more like hardcore and punk stuff. So it just sort of moved more into the underground.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, Metallica became the biggest band in the world.
Yeah, there were a couple bands that survived. It thrived in the 90s. 80s bands that started in the 80s, established themselves in the 80s, that thrived in the 90s here, at least. One was Metallica, because the Black Album came out, I believe, in 91 or early 92.
Yeah.
So they just beat, the whole grunge thing really taking off. Ozzy's No More Tears also came out, I think, in like 90, 91, 92. And again, sort of beating Ozzy through smart management or whatever you want to say, but No More Tears, Osmosis were huge records. Ozfest, the Osbournes, Ozzy, his stock rose in the 90s, as did Metallica. People will say Pantera, and I know Pantera had albums out in the 80s when they were sort of a different vibe, but to me, they didn't really start their sound till the 90s. But you could consider, Pantera was definitely a heavy band, and they definitely thrived in the 90s. But a lot of other bands, they didn't. Priest, Maiden, Dio, all the LA bands, they all suffered. Motley maybe kept themselves somewhat relevant in the 90s, Motley Crue, but that was more because of drama with individual band members, not really because of the music. Very few of those bands survived, and a lot of them, like we mentioned, Winger at the beginning of this, those bands were just, their careers were ended. They could not play. I remember seeing some of these bands in the 90s, and they were reduced to playing to small clubs, to under 100 people, if that. During that time period, they were really sort of knocked out of the game, if you will. And it wasn't until then the late 90s, Bruce comes back to Maiden, Rob comes back to Priest, Ozzy comes back to Sabbath. MTV starts doing all these, VH1, I should say, starts doing all these behind the music. And there's sort of this, you start seeing these retro hair metal radio shows appearing on American radio. And all of a sudden in the late 90s, early 2000s, it starts to come back, and you have this resurgence, if you will, of classic metal. The hair metal bands start getting back together. Motley and Rat and Dawkins and all these bands, they start getting back together and start releasing records. So,
I mean, Guns N' Roses were massive. I wouldn't say that Guns N' Roses is metal by any stretch, but at the same time, playing sort of guitar-orientated heavy rock, they were really, really big too. Which is kind of strange when you think of it, because the way I saw it and see it was that it wasn't really, and I know people will hate me for this, but to my ears, there isn't a super amount of difference between Guns N' Roses and a lot of these so-called hair metal bands playing like pumped up rock music with a bit of naughty aggression sort of vibe to it, vocals sounding a bit in the same ballpark. So it's, but they had a very different image and aura to their appearance. So I guess that's a big part of the difference.
Even, I just looked, Use Your Illusion, when they released both those records at the same time, 91. So they got in right before the whole thing happened. And that's sort of a theme here. Ozzy, No More Tears, Black Album, they all came out like right before it really exploded. And they were good records that managed to keep them, to carry them through the 90s. So it was just sort of a timing thing in some ways. If they had waited maybe a couple more years, maybe those albums wouldn't have had, who knows, maybe they would have, maybe they wouldn't have, but yeah.
But I mean, basically what we're talking about is that trends come and go. Some bands sort of use up their good material and have to reboot, and that happened to be the case with, again, we're naming the same bands, but I mean we're talking about Maiden, Priest.
It's sort of those classic 80s bands that were established and made their mark like 80 to 86 or something like that. The early thrash bands, the early classic bands. You could throw the thrash bands in here too. Anthrax and Megadeth slipped in with not what is the name of the album with Symphony of Destruction on it?
Is that Euthanasia? No, it's
No,
Countdown to Extinction.
Countdown to Extinction. That came in like 91, 92 also.
Yeah.
You know, they managed to sort of hang in there for a little bit, but then they dropped off. But so yeah, I know what you mean.
So to summarize things, did grunge really kill metal? I say no.
No.
But at the same time, or even was the so-called grunge bands in some way the competition? Were they the opposite of those so-called metal bands that we're talking about? Not, I mean, okay, Pearl Jam is more like, to use a modern phrase, like classic rock. But I mean, like you said before, Soundgarden is more Sabbathy. Alice in Chains has the same quality to them. I mean, I would say that's metal too. Actually, when I first saw Alice in Chains in a Kerrang or whatever, I was buying Metal Hammer or something like that, and I saw pictures of them when they released their first album, Facelift. I was sort of thrown off by it because on those first photos, they looked like any hair metal band from LA. Yeah. I mean, I was like, okay, I won't listen to them. I just shrugged them off. And then when they released Dirt, and I heard Wood or whatever, any of those songs, it was like, this is really good. What is this? It's Alice in Chains. Oh, that band. Guess you shouldn't judge the book by its cover or whatever, but well, there you go. But I'm glad we have now the metal community can sleep safe. No, grunge did not kill metal. It killed wimpy bands that no one cared about. All right, well, there you go. Mainstream audience. But we don't care about those.
We've set the record straight on this. Let us know in the comments down below. What was your experience with it? Maybe if you're somebody from a different country, you know, how was the impact of grunge on heavy metal where you're from? Let us know in the comments down below. Let us know what your thoughts are.
And if I may add to that, you and me, we are about the same age. What does someone who is a bit younger think, or even older? Did they have the same? What did they? I like to know. Please write in the comments below. I would like to read them.
Yeah, great point. Right, if your age, maybe if you were you were your early teens during the 90s. Yeah. Were you even sort of aware of this whole dynamic between grunge and metal? You know, let us know in the comments down below. We'd love to read it. Thanks again to Matthias for joining me here at the Lair of the Alchemist. I have a feeling we will be seeing him again. And until we see you all next time, make sure you stay heavy, stay metal.